and welcome to Radical Engagements. You'll notice the way that we do things here is changing at Farm Vlog. I am doing shorter text in Radical Engagements than I have in the past. The expansion to run to cover sections of books has not been a particularly great idea. And in lieu of that, I've decided to cover publicly available essays of a variety of topics. You've already got a taste of that with the Forgetting Mark Fisher piece published over at Platypus, but we'll be going through all kinds of short essays here on Radical Engagements. There'll be longer engagements, particularly for patrons, but this will be what we do in this series for the most part from now on. We may occasionally cover publicly available chapters of books. And that's because I think this way of engaging text deeply is actually useful. And I think I can do a series that is complete in a couple of weeks on one or two essays much more thoroughly and fairly, and without having to really get into the possibility of violating fair use laws than I could otherwise. And today we're doing something a little different. Instead of engaging with a Marxist, I'm engaging with an ecocentrist, particularly the writer, druid, and blogger, general weird guy about town, John Michael Greer. Greer is a hard man to put on the political spectrum. I've heard him called everything from a left-winger to an eco-fascist. I don't think any of those things are particularly fair. I became aware of his work both in spirituality and in ecology over a decade and a half ago. I think I started reading him in the very first years of the Obama administration, back when he was the Grand Archdruid of the Ancient Order of Druids in America, the AODA, which he no longer works with. He lives in Rhode Island. He's kind of a strange guy. He's written a ton of books, more than I can really lay out. At least 10 on economics and politics, at least 30 on spirituality and the occult. And he's written short stories for all kinds of stuff. So he's a pretty broad guy. I think that is something to note about him. And I would say nobody would confuse him for a leftist. This essay was published actually the same day I'm reading it, although you will get it probably a few weeks to a month later, on October 8th, 2023, for his blog, Echo Sophia. And it's called Bracing for Impact, and I will put a link to it in the show notes. I'm going to do what I always do and kind of verbally annotate this as I read it with you. I have read this before, obviously, although since this is so new, I literally read it this morning for the first time. So you're getting kind of a raw annotation. So I'm going to continue doing this and kind of engage and explicate and debate the text. So this is John Michael Greer's piece, and we begin it now. I think it was Lenin who said that there are decades in which nothing happens, and there are months in which decades happen. Pause. That gets attributed to Lenin all the time, and I've attributed it to Lenin myself. I've actually tried to source that, and I can't find it in Lenin. The earliest mention of it that I can seemingly find is actually by George Galloway, attributing it to Lenin in the late 90s. And it's been repeated over and over again since then. He may have said something like it, but it's not in his collected works as far as I can find. And I'm not the only person who's looked for it. So if someone can find the specific citation, the original in context, that'd be great. I've never found it. So we're just going to put that as apocryphal Lenin there. All right. So not a great start for me to have to correct an apocryphal Lenin quotation, But let's go on. This is John Michael Greer again. It is a useful reminder that the pace of historic change is not smooth. This is Varn talking. Duh. We have seen the immense changes take place over the last few decades, but in the industrial world at least, most of them have happened slowly. Recent headlines suggest, though, that the pace is picking up to a remarkable extent. A brief summary of the landscape of the crisis ahead of us thus may be helpful. This is Varn speaking again. I would say that I agree with this, and I've definitely felt like things have been accelerating post-COVID, that COVID was the straw that exposed many broken camelbacks. But in lieu of the polycrisis, or the triple crisis, whatever hip academic word we want to use for it, polycrisis meaning, multiple crises, triple crisis being ecological, economic, and social. There's been a lot of predictions about this polycrisis that just hasn't been true. In some way, it's been both speeding up and yet not doing all the apocalyptic breaks the way people seem to think. It's something to think about when we talk about this, because I think it's hard to understand the scope of change. I mean, if we really want to say, oh, it's been slow, but yet if we start with 9/11, the past 23 years has been dramatic. But then so was, the years of 1971 and 1992. So, and then what the post-war years, they were all peaceful and hunky-dory too. There's not a time where we don't see this. It's what you're focusing on and who can ignore it, right? If you're in Sierra Leone or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you can't ignore a lot of stuff. It really depends on where you're at. But for the core of the industrialized world, I think Greer might have a point. Of course, he would never talk about it this way, and that's fair. Right, back to his essay. As I write these words to start with, Russian forces on the eastern front of the Russo-Ukrainian war have pushed their way through the Ukrainian lines and are moving to encircle the fortress of Avdiivka, the linchpin of the Ukrainian defenses in the western Donbass. At the same time, the war between Israel and Hamas militant movement is blazing. At least 300,000 Israeli troops converge on the Gaza Strip, while Israeli and Hezbollah forces exchange rocket fire across the northern border. Asterisk. I don't like talking about these wars as they're ongoing. I've seen much irresponsible commentary on the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Palestinian situation. I suppose that's a war. It doesn't feel a war usually requires two sides that are both equally valid in their fighting capacity, and that doesn't seem to be the case in the Palestinian and Israeli situation. But nonetheless, this is not to say I don't take sides. I think it's absolutely crucial that we are clear that the occupation that has lasted 75 years and the context of the occupation after the 1967 war, as well as things intensifying after the Palestinian mini civil war of 2006 to 2008, and the response to the marches in 2019 and all the intifadas are perfect context for why that happened. Why there was so much rage, why the security breach led to a particular strong amount of violence. That can all be contextualized. Beyond that, well, let's say I hope that the apartheid is ended, and I'll leave it at that. As Israeli and Hezbollah forces exchange rocket fire across the northern border. An assortment of other wars flare elsewhere, unnoticed by most people in the industrial nations, such as Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example, are the contested borders all over Africa. The outrage fan by our corporate media is always highly selective. Absolutely. John Michael Greer. Absolutely. As is trying to cover the situation on the ground. The two wars just named are important to be sure, and so are the other ones that aren't getting the same amount of attention. One of the ways you can tell that a regional global hegemon is strong is that the wars in their bailiwick tend to decrease in fluency. One of the ways you can tell that a hegemon is losing its dominant position in turn is that the wars intimate June in the song from the musical Carousel. See, that's a sentence. I'm going to read that. One of the ways that you can tell a hegemon is losing its dominant position in turn is that the wars intimate June in the song from the music Carousel and start busting out all over. Russia and Hamas both gambled that the US and its allies were too weak to be able to stage an effective response to the war. With Hamas, it's much too early to tell. But with Russia, so far has done very well by its war in Ukraine and seems to be confident in pushing it forward. I think that's true enough, except that it did not start doing well, and one would have thought that they wanted this war over much quicker than it does. A good war does not last this long. There hasn't been many good wars in the 21st or late 20th century, though. That's why they go on seemingly forever. So while it's interesting to me, it's one of these framings of multipolarity, and I suspect he's not going to use this terminology, but Greer's probably reading into this. I take the unpopular position that multipolarity is like rain. It's both inevitable and it matters what you do with it. But that in its interim, it will lead to a lot of violence. Historically speaking, the people who've studied this, including Dubin, but also the classical British geopolitical thinkers who came up with it in the beginning of the 20th century, always said that what it leads to is small states from far away engaging with hegemons who are far away as seeming patrons to protect them from local hegemons, which can assault regional control. And it leads to things like the Monroe Doctrine or World War I, depending on a lot of other contexts. This is not good or bad in the sense that it's not a position that can remain stable without, the various regional hegemons, in this case, they'll be trade hegemons, really coming to terms with each other and accepting certain limitations. If they do that, then things could be decent, even for, quote, core countries. Empire is not always good for the vast majority of the people, even within the empire, particularly in its late period. Ask the British, ask the Romans, ask the Byzantines. Hell, ask the Ottomans. I can go on. In fact, you can see here by my examples, I don't even just mean capitalist cultures. This is a much older thing. But this can go south very quickly. I mean, the most deadly and turbulent centuries in the historical record are time periods where these regional hegemonies break down. The 7th century, the calamitous 14th century, the establishment of modernity in the 15th century. These are times of multipolarity, to use such a vague and kind of unhelpful term into how much it actually applies to. Singular hegemonic empires are actually historically rare, and a world hegemon is pretty much unique. Now, I've gone over this in a lot of different places, so I'm not going to focus on it here, but it's something to think about. I do think the United States is becoming a regional world power, a very strong one in a lot of ways, both geographically and resources and its productive capacity, etc. But for the majority of people who live under that, it's going to seem like stagnation, and I think that's what we're experiencing. I also think it's going to lead to a lot of conflicts that have been kept down by pure brute and nasty force of of a world hegemonic power in the transatlantic superstate And we should really refer to it like that. I get that from Daniel Besner, but I think it's actually correct. In that there's been NATO and the World Bank and the IMF have worked, and parts of the UN, in so much the UN works at all, have worked as kind of a transatlantic governance system, of which started to break down by the US's own actions in the Iraq War. As soon as it became a unipolar actor, it started acting hubristically. That's not unique to the United States, but given the scale of the situation, it would have probably larger consequences than it's had in the past. Now, let's go back to the essay. We're only a couple paragraphs in. Back to John Michael Greer. Meanwhile, several less dramatic but equally explosive crises are building. Those of my readers who pay attention to the economic news already know that the real estate markets worldwide are in trouble. Asterisk. Yes, even in China. Actually, almost especially in China. An asterisk. There's a fine witch's brew of reasons for the impending crisis, but the most important is that the big players in the real estate finance their purchases with cheap short-term debt. Now that debt isn't cheap anymore, and the big players are over their heads in loans that they can't pay off or even cover interest. Plenty of other economic interests are in deep trouble as a result, and the possibility of really ugly global recession can't be ruled out. This is Warren speaking. I think this is true, but I don't think it'll look like 2007 for a variety of reasons. One is where the problems are. It's more commercial real estate or infrastructure investment in the case of China than it is general investment. I mean, our private, private debt as assets as it was in the aughts. I think we're going to see something very different. All right. Nor can the U.S. simply keep printing money and churning out unpayable IOUs to cover the gap and to keep the economy humming away as we've done in the last 50 years. Asterisk. That's true if we're losing hegemony, actually. But as long as there's hegemony, yes, actually it can. I'm not an MMTer, as I've said. Parts of MMT are true. But if you can compel people to buy your goods in your money, then your money is an access to your goods, meaning the more money there is created, which is created through debt, it's literally created through lending, the better things will be as far as locking down your hegemonic supply goals. But that's only true when you can force people to pay in your money. And when you can't do that, or when there's no singular state currency that dominates like that, then things are quite different. All right. The deficit spending of the last half century was possibly because U.S. dollar and was the global currency of trade. Okay, yes, he's right about that. And the economic globalization forced every bank around the world to stockpile dollar-denominated investments as the basis for credit-based cash flows. That's true. Now the global economy is coming apart as other nations realize the ongoing inflation of the dollar imposes a hidden tax on every transaction. Absolutely. And Russia demonstrates that being able to make everything you need within your own borders has a certain hard advantages. It hasn't actually demonstrated that, though, as the collapse of the ruble this year indicates. So, and most countries can't make everything in their own borders. You have to be a nation the size of a U.S. or Russia or China to do that. I want you to think about what that means, John Michael Greer, because I think even you don't. Definitely a lot of MMTers don't seem to. The dollar isn't going to be forced out of global trade all at once. It's not going to be forced out of global trade at all. Sorry, man. I've been hearing people predict this imminently, including people like Michael Hudson, for a whole 2 years, and they're not being held accountable for the fact that it's happening slowly, but their catastrophic predictions just are not happening. And John Michael Greer, you also have a history of quasi-catastrophic predictions that also don't happen. So I just want to remind you of that. Instead, the dollar faces the same death of 1,000 cuts that doomed the British pound sterling once seen able status as a global reserve currency. Yeah, although it took Brexit to finally accelerate that decline, man. It took over 100 years. I don't think it's going to take the U.S. over 100 years to become a regional reserve currency. The thing is, there's no reserve currency that's going to replace it. What makes this a challenge is the U.S. is effectively bankrupt. The U.S. national debt is over $33 trillion now, and something like half of that staggering sum has been accrued since 2008. Yeah. So a huge sum can never be paid back. The questions remain are when the default happens and what forms it takes. That may never happen, dude. The thing is, recognizing and reevaluating your debt, or your calling for that in as an asset may not be worth anyone to do. We'll see. This matters because the entire U.S. economy and the lifestyles of most Americans depend on the gasoline inflows of raw materials and manufactured goods from abroad. It's less true than you think, paid for by unpayable IOUs mentioned above. Also less true than you think. This is the radical politics of someone who paid attention 10 years ago. Yes, there are tons of influxes from abroad. But there's also a lot of stuff that isn't influxed. And all this is not just one nation moving to another. It's totally interfucking connected, which is why, what Russia or China are trying to do, decoupling, hasn't worked as well as anyone thought. Now it's worked better than total collapse. And Russia's still been able to pursue the war. Although, again, as I pointed out, Russia probably should have been able to run this war much sooner. All right. When the market for those IOUs dries up and it's faltering, I would love evidence for that, John Michael Greer. Americans are going to have to get used to living with a lot less energy and a lot fewer consumer goods than they think they are entitled to. I can't suspect many of them will take it well. I think that's both true, but the level of how true that is going to remain to be seen. And that's what we have to deal with. That's already been happening. That's part of what this inflation gig is about. There does need to be a reshuffling of consumer goods. It needs to happen, and it should. We're going to stop right here. I'm going to come back. You hear me kind of questioning a lot of these assumptions. It's not that I think most of these are false, but the idea, for example, that there's just going to be a realization of American bankruptcy is actually, it's not. Most of the dollars owned in the U.S. debt aren't paid for by IOUs abroad. They're paid. That's not how that works. Our major trading partner isn't China anymore. It's Mexico. Like this is a kind of, it's true enough to be misleading understanding of the situation. Just like Americans who have stopped looking at the Ukraine war, because in some ways if it's a conventional war, it becomes a war of attrition and it favors Russia. This is aimed at making Russia not able to rule the separatist republics, that's a whole different matter. And then it's fourth generation warfare, and then it favors the insurgents. What is clear is that the West's interest and ability of maintaining it as anything other than a bleed out on Russia, and seems unlikely. Most of the people speaking about these wars have made predictions that were wrong on both sides. No people hold them accountable to it because people want to use this as proxies for other beliefs. That's always true. You can't fault people for that. But it's something people should think about when evaluating these sources and these broad declamations. However, I think the broad spectrum so far of what John Michael Greer is arguing for has parts of it that are very true. The U.S. will not go away. It's not going to become a powerless state. It's not even become the British Empire. Its geography doesn't really, Britain now. Its geography is entirely different. The material context do have to be weighed in, but the U.S. has squandered its unipolar dominance. Even as an empire, if you look at it in imperial management, it's not done particularly well. And there are reasons for that. It's not clear that anyone would do particularly well. A unipolar world probably isn't a good idea. But we shouldn't just celebrate multipolarity for its own sake, because that can look a billion different ways, and it's something that we have to consider. All right. we'll come back to John Michael Greer in the next episode. Thank you for your support. Like and subscribe. Comment down below. I want to hear your thoughts. I know many of you are going to disagree with my pessimistic reading of everything, including my pessimistic reading of John Michael Greer's pessimism. And be looking for changes here at Farm Vlog.